We're going to talk about different types of attacks here. Now, when I'm talking about attacks, I'm going to go back quite a ways now and talk about some different types of network attacks back when network attacks were really predominant and there were lots of different types of attacks. We had things like Smurf attacks, and you can see here I'm going to run a little demonstration of a Smurf attack here. So what a Smurf attack is where you ping a broadcast address and you can see rather than one response, I'm getting multiple responses. So I'm getting responses from several different systems on this particular subnet. So a Smurf attack was where you used something called a Smurf amplifier, where there was a broadcast address somewhere out on the internet, and if you were to spoof a source address, the responses would go back to that source address and you could overwhelm somebody with ICMP echo replies. And if it was a really big network that belonged to, you could get a lot of replies. And as I said, you could really overwhelm a target that way. We figured that out about a dozen years or so ago and figured out that we should shut down what we call directed broadcasts. And so these Smurf amplifiers don't work anymore. They've pretty much been shut down. I'm not aware of any that still exist, although it's possible that you might find a Smurf amplifier somewhere. There were all sorts of other attacks as well, like there was something called the Nestea attack. And I've got the source code for it here. And this has to do with attacking the way that the kernel handled messages in the TCP/IP stack. And if you use this Nestea attack, you could get a system to basically just fall over and you'd cause a denial of service. There are several other similar attacks. We've got the teardrop, we've got new tier. There were also other attacks like land and La Tierra and all sorts of other attacks that really targeted the way that systems handled their IP packets. So, for example, you could send a whole bunch of fragments and then have the system put those fragments back together in an overlapping fashion. So you could craft packets such that the system would have to overlap the packets, and that used to be enough to cause systems to crash. There were all sorts of other bugs in IP stacks, and there were a lot of different attacks that you could use to take systems down in that way. The nice thing about that is that you could see those types of attacks if you had like an IDS that was aware of those sorts of things. Then we ran into the very first distributed denial of service attacks. And those started with a piece of software called the Tribe Flood Network that turned into something else called Trinu, and finally turned into something called Stacheldraht. And Stacheldraht is a piece of software that was used by a guy by the name of Mafia Boy from Montreal. And he used this piece of software, Stacheldraht, in order to attack systems like Yahoo and eBay and several others in February of 2000 and took those systems offline. And we spent a lot of time on the phone between service providers that day of the attack trying to figure out how we were going to get these attacks stopped, because they were often spoofed IPs and you couldn't figure out where they were really coming from. And those distributed denial of service attacks actually led to a lot of research that led to things like backscatter and other ways of handling distributed denial of service attacks. But since we've come into a case now where a lot of the original network attacks have been pretty well blocked, we have a case where the attackers have really moved up the stack. And now you've got tools like Metasploit, where you can launch attacks quickly and easily against higher levels in the IP stack. So basically, we're going against the application layer and maybe the session layer or something along those lines. So in this case, I'm having problems with my Metasploit, and I don't know whether it's going to come up or not. But at the moment, there are several hundred attacks within Metasploit, and it's constantly being updated. So we're moving up the stack with Metasploit, and we're also moving up the stack when it comes to things like web attacks, because web attacks attack the application layer, and it's not something we can protect against easily at the network level with things like firewalls, because you've got to keep the port for the web service open, and you need something like a web application firewall that's going to pull the packet apart and see what's actually going on. And so it's harder to see things like cross-site scripting or SQL injection at the network layer and try to mitigate the problems either there or at the transport layer. So protecting against attacks has certainly become a lot harder over the years, although initially when all of those old style attacks like Nestea and Smurf and Teardrop and all of those sorts of things, when those were going around and were really popular, we had a hard time protecting against them as well, because lots of people hadn't subscribed to the philosophy that you really needed a firewall if you were going to be connected to the internet. But there's a lot of different types of attacks out there now, and what I've gone over here is just really not even starting to skim the surface of what's around and what's available.